much. I will move over there and show some slides because not to do you in with PowerPoint, but I have some charts and graphs that I think make the point. These graphs deal with the UK government's plan for how to achieve the renewable energy targets. But in going through them, I want to focus today a bit less on the numbers, although you will see the numbers of gigawatts in each area and so on, and more on what we see as some of the challenges, policy challenges and other challenges behind achieving the different parts of this. Because just about every area of growth that we have involves controversy, challenge, opposition, et cetera. I would take the view that, in considering the opposition to any of these renewables, the first question should be, compared to what? You don't want to do this because of you object to A, B, and C, but what are we displacing from the energy mix in order to do it, and what are the issues with regard to that? We might talk about some of those. Now, it's a friend and sometimes colleague of mine, Jonathan Parrott, is wont to say that the UK is the leading country in Europe for renewable energy targets. We have had more targets that we've missed than any other country, and we currently sit third from the bottom of all the countries in the EU. We are third from the bottom in terms of the percentage of renewable energy that we have today. So although our target is only 15% of all energy from renewables by 2020, that is today about a little bit more than 5 times. We're a bit below 3%, so a little bit more than 5 times where we are. Having said that, when this was passed, when this whole idea of the 20% across the EU of all energy from renewables was settled, it would have been a 10 times increase for us. When we published when we started working on our strategy, which we published last July, when they started working on the strategy, it was a 7.5 times. By the time it was published, it was 6 times, and now it's 5 times. So we are making progress, but we have a hell of a long way to go. So when I came into my current role in January of this year, as chair of the Office of Renewable Energy, and I should say that our structure in the Department for Energy and Climate Change is that when this department was created, because we had no energy department, in fact, until 2 years ago. There used to be an energy department, but there hasn't been one for a long time. One of the ideas in the structuring of the Department of Energy and Climate Change was that there were 3 offices. One for the Office of Nuclear Development, Office of Renewable Energy, and Office of Carbon Capture. And these offices are charged with a focus on delivering what the government says they want to do, or what, in the case of both renewables and our overall CO2 reductions, we are legally committed to doing. And delivery is not a natural role for the civil service. To have a civil service department that's charged with delivery of something, which is not even partially, at most is at most partially in our control, certainly not completely in our control. There's not a natural role. So these are delivery bodies, and that's what we are about. So I came in as chairman. Each of these offices has a chairman, part-time chairman, and a chief executive and some staff. And we began in January to say, okay, we've published a strategy, which I'll show you one slide on in a minute. What's the plan? Because a strategy and a plan, from my background in business, are not the same thing. So let's try and make a plan. And I want to show you some of the plan today and talk about some of the challenges. So with that preamble, I will show you a few slides and we'll run through it, and then we can have a discussion of some of the issues around this. So let's see. If I do this, that will fun. Okay, so this is about the renewables delivery plan, and let's start to say, when we published the Renewable Energy Strategy, everything has to be an acronym, so that is the RES. When we published the RES, is this working, this microphone? Okay, fine. Included in the RES, which is a big fat document, there's one figure which actually summarizes the whole 150 pages of it, in my view, and that's this, which was what was called the lead scenario. And this was something produced in one building in Whitehall, so you know it has broad support. So a group produced this, and it really, I would characterize it as a top-down, rational set, which says a person coming and looking at this would say, oh, well, yeah, I might argue that you need a little bit, that we'll get a little bit less of this and a little bit more of that, but I could believe that we could get to 15%, that there is a way that we could get to 15%. But it is not more than that. That's what it was. It was a sort of, can we conclude that it's possible to do it? Yes. And if we look at it, and we will come back to this, it seems to have overprinted a bit here, but there's a mixture of wind, transport, we can say more about what's in there, but this is essentially assumed to be biofuels in road transport, and some heat stuff, and quite a lot here and here of biomass. So biomass used in transport, biomass used in heat, and biomass electricity, a little bit of biomass electricity. Those are the big components of this, and a few other things. So we will come back and look at this in more detail, but this is the RES lead scenario, and I will, in later slides, a whole series of slides we will run through, show you what these numbers mean in terms of gigawatts or terawatt hours of electricity and so on, or terawatt hours of energy. We put everything on that basis. Okay, so what we're now trying to do is produce a renewables delivery plan, and we do that bottom up. That is, ask everyone who has to actually build something, what's your ambition? How much do you think you're going to get done by 2020? And actually, we asked the question a little more sophisticated than that, but I'll come on to it in a minute, but to determine what's the commitment of the market to delivering the target. Does it come out that if you ask people, how much do you think you're going to do in onshore wind, it's the most sophisticated one, does it have any relationship to what we said in the renewable energy strategy we were going to do? We also want to know better than we have been, and I think this is an important part of any plan. Those of you who are in business will, many in this room will know that you better find out in a timely fashion, are you achieving the plan? And if you're off, then you can take some measures to compensate. But if you don't know where you are, then you can get pretty far off course before you ever find out. And we don't have that information. We want to be able to know for all the technologies that we're doing, what's happening to the costs. Because in government, we are subsidizing these technologies. And we're subsidizing, I'll say more about the subsidies a little later, but we're subsidizing them really in order to drive a decrease in the cost. That, if we didn't believe that the cost of the 35th gigawatt of offshore wind was going to be a lot lower than the first gigawatt of offshore wind, as a result of our doing something, it would be better for us to just shoot ourselves rather than go on with this. We have to believe that, and we have to be sure that that's happening. So we need a way of understanding what's going on. And there are many ways you can cut a plan on renewables. The way I'm going to show you is by technology, but you can do it by different geographies, you can do it by different sectors of how the energy is used and so on. We also really want to find the lowest cost route to the target. So we don't want to spend more than we absolutely have to, even though some people will get rich by our spending more than we have to doing a higher cost route. And that is a live controversy which has flared up over the current spending review. Are we over-subsidizing some things which are not material? Have we put in place, or did the previous government put in place something which over-subsidized certain technologies? And ultimately, the way we will get the lowest cost route, not only to the 2020 target, but to the period beyond 2020 as well, is by maintaining the confidence of the market, because this is all delivered by the market rather than by government. This is not like the Chinese deciding we're going to open a new coal-fired power station this week. It is the market has to do this. The only way we're going to work that this is going to work is if government sends signals and puts in place policies which maintain the confidence of the market that this is going to get done. And that the policies that are in place when you commit to making your investment which are designed to remunerate that investment, give you a return on that investment in renewables, that those will not be removed subsequently, that you will get what we say you're going to get. Okay. So we've structured the plan around ambition, as I've talked about, constraints and risks. And one of the things that Chris Yoon, our Secretary of State, has said is that our job in government now is to put up on the wall all the constraints, all the risks, all the barriers that exist, and figure out what are we doing. There are hundreds of these. What are we doing to remove this barrier? Or have we as government even created the barrier? I would say a bit about the decision-making processes for how do people decide whether they're going to do certain renewable energy. We want to understand that. The pipeline I've already talked about, what's in the pipeline. That sight of that lets us know whether we're on track. Costs, we don't necessarily have a consensus view on the costs today. Many of you will have heard all kinds of numbers thrown around about the costs of renewables versus other technologies. What we really want is an insight and to establish a consensus, at least for us, of the trajectory of costs so that we have some idea where these costs are going to be in 2020. And that's harder. Geography, because Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland to some extent, but particularly Scotland and to a great extent Wales, play a big role in our delivery of the UK target. And some of this is devolved and some of it is not devolved, and we need to understand the geographical implications. And how will we measure success? So that's the element of a plan. And now we're going to look at some of the outputs. So when we ask the question about what's your ambition, we asked it with two other points. One is we said, don't just tell us what you think you're going to deliver by 2020, tell it to us in 2-year intervals between now and then. How much do you think you're going to do in the next 2 years and the next 2 and so on up to 2020? And secondly, we said, don't just give us one number, give us a central number and then a high and a low number. The high and the low for 2020 are comprised, you get to the high and the low by two different things coming into the same statement. First of all, there's just inherent uncertainty. We're going to build, we believe our company can sell 100,000 heat pumps, and install them by 2020, plus or minus 10% or plus or minus 20%. So there's just the uncertainty part. But there is also a part which is more interesting, which says we can do 100,000 heat pumps as long as the renewable heat incentive is in place by this date, and we have this functioning, and homeowners know that they can get this, et cetera. Or, if you do this on planning consents, we'll be able to deliver it. But if you don't remove this barrier to planning, we're never going to get there. So the constraints, the barriers, also influence the range from this low to the high. And here is what comes out of this. And this was not fixed in this way. We didn't know how it would come out. So our 15% renewables target requires us to deliver by 2020 235 terawatt hours per year of renewable energy. And the adding up all of the central estimates from all different technologies came out to be 248. Well, okay, I mean, it just came out there. We didn't fix it. That's what it came out to be. But it's plus or minus 30%. So there's a very big range. And probably if you were a more sophisticated, statistically minded person and you wanted to look at propagation of uncertainties and so on, you would say it's actually much greater than that. Because we just added everything up here, but the uncertainties will be greater than that. Okay, but these curves, I just want to stress this, these and the subsequent curves I'm going to show you, this is not artwork. This is the result of hundreds of meetings with people, interviews, review of documents, and so on that took place over a couple of months earlier this year. Okay, now, this, with its very interesting color scheme, is the components of the central case, which says this is how we would do it. And I think it's somewhat interesting to look at. So at the base, we have, I will run through this, we have two technologies which together contribute about 10% to the target, which are in place today, have been, and are not growing. And those are hydro and landfill gas. At one time, in 2000, landfill gas was the biggest source of renewable energy in the UK. Today it's one of the smallest, but it just goes on. As we're reducing what goes into landfill, and there's less being generated and so on, but people are still putting in new generation, so we still have it. And for hydro, certainly for most hydro, we've used up all the sites, the good sites, so there's no growth in that. Okay, so that's the base. The next two bars are offshore wind and onshore wind. And you can see that these, in the central case, are quite a big portion of getting to the target. We'll see this more as we run through other slides, but the difference is that onshore wind is already growing rapidly and has most of its growth in the first half of the decade, and then grows more slowly in the second half of the decade. Whereas offshore wind grows relatively slowly here, but has huge growth between 2015 and 2020 as the big projects come on stream. We already have quite a lot by some standards, even by world standards of offshore wind, but it's very small compared to what the ambition is. Okay, so that's wind, a very big portion. The next two bars, the next three bars are all about biomass. And they are biomass biomass for transport, biomass electricity, and biomass heat. And let's be clear, we're talking about 15% of all energy from renewables. Without tackling heat, we never get there. 47% of our CO2 emissions come from heat, a huge portion of our energy. Unless we tackle heat, we never get there. And heat is the place where there's been the least activity. We know how to decarbonize electricity. If we really wanted to completely decarbonize electricity, there are technologies to do it. And there are mechanisms to do it, and countries have gone very far in this direction. But there's been very little done on heat. You know, I would say 2 years ago, the level of discussion was burn wood, or just use electricity, get renewable electricity and use that for heating, which is still part of the discussion, I would say. And the transport part I will say a little bit more about, which is, as some of you are very familiar with the EU directive, it has some peculiarities on the transport side. And you mentioned in your introduction about the electric vehicle thing, which is one of the quirks in and one of the interesting things in the EU target. Okay, the next two bars are heat pumps, ground source and air source heat pumps, which are today negligible. You can't even see them here, but expand to be quite a material part. These 7 technologies give 210 terawatt hours, and then we have another 20 or so, or 15 from the 2 at the base. Everything else, and there are 22 on this chart altogether, so take away 9. The other 13 are all in here. They're all small. For the most part, they are the most expensive, not completely, but for the most part, they're the most expensive technologies. And and there is a big policy question. The big open policy question is, which of these are going to be important beyond 2020 and should be supported for that reason? Which of them are important for economic development in the UK and will be important beyond 2020 and should be supported? And which of them is it not worth our spending money on right now? And that's a big question for us. So this gives you, in a summary, the central case of the plan and some of the issues, and I'll just go through some others. This is where we are on pipeline. And this part of this is the whole 235, the terawatt hours, the 15% target. And what this shows is we had 48 terawatt hours of renewable generation in 2008. And then we look at, we could update this now to 2009. And then we look at what's in planning, what's under construction, and what's the gap. But so this is the whole target, but actually in here, all we really have is large-scale electricity. And the encouraging thing about that is we have quite a lot in the system already for large-scale electricity, so that we can have some confidence actually for onshore wind, for our central case, between 85 and 90% of what we expect in the central case to happen by 2020 is already in the planning system someplace or under construction. We've overviewed these numbers down for historical success rates. We are doing a lot of work now, and have been for the last month or so, on how do we get this kind of information about things which are inherently more decentralized, like heat pumps. And some of the biomass stuff, the big biomass stuff is in here, some of the other biomass stuff isn't. We actually know another big chunk of this because part of the road transport is governed by the renewable transport fuels obligation, which will deliver half of our transport target by 2014, but we don't have in place policies to deliver the second half of the transport target. So we actually know more of this. This is somewhat encouraging, I would say. Okay, so as I said, these curves come from a set of data. we're looking at what's driving deployment and what's constraining it. We know that the outcomes that we get depend on how aggressively government can remove the constraints. That's our job. And so I'm going to look at some examples. We'll just run through these, and you'll see that it just gives you an idea that the nature of the different technologies, the development of them is very different. And I'll comment inter alia on some of the problems that occur with them. So this is onshore wind. In the RES lead scenario, we said we would go for 13.9 gigawatts of onshore wind. Our central case is now a little bit higher than that. That means that by 2020, we would have 6,800 turbines of the current size that we're using onshore installed. This is a large number. If you take, the guys in Wales have said, their big problem is not getting these permitted and agreed by planning, but just moving the blades and the equipment to the sites on narrow and curving roads. If you did it this way, they would have to do something like 3,500 oversized loads between now and 2020. In other words, every day, 10 oversized loads. You wouldn't do it that way, but every day from now to 2020, you would have to be moving 10 oversized loads on the road. This is, so there are logistical problems that you have to think about. In fact, in Wales, one of the problems is they often have to build roads. There are no roads to the site where the offshore wind is going to be. There's quite a big range. The growth rates are high, but not high compared to historical numbers or to what other countries have achieved. We believe this is doable, and there is a lot in process. But there is increasingly a local public complaint about offshore wind. And it has become almost the case that local objection turns down most of the onshore wind applications, and then they are agreed on appeal. This is not a good situation. And the government's approach to this is to push for more benefit to the local communities from the onshore wind projects. There's been a very good model developed in Scotland called the Fintry model, where the local community actually become active investors. So if there's going to be 5 wind turbines built, 3 megawatts each, the community actually invests to build a 6th. All the infrastructure is common. They don't have to put in the expertise, but they have a share of the benefits. There are other models that are being used. I think it's the right thing, but we have a long way to go to get it developed and propagated. So we have problems here. It is clear in any case that even if we get to the higher number, we are pretty much leveled off by 2020. We will have used, at the higher number, we will have used up all the good sites for onshore wind in the UK, pretty much. Big ones. Still may be people sticking turbines on supermarkets and so on. Okay. Here's offshore wind. Completely different, right? Our ambition today is much higher than it was a year and a half ago when we published the RES. There are a lot of developers, including some from this country, who are actively pursuing offshore wind developments. We are doing a lot on the offshore grid, and this is a very big focus. Is it expensive? Yes. Is it really expensive compared to new coal with CCS? Not very. But it's certainly expensive electricity compared to a new CCGT or to onshore wind, for that matter. We clearly have a big ambition for offshore wind. We are doing a lot of work on it. It is a very big focus of our attention in DEC and of industry attention, and there are a lot of big players involved in this. This is biomass electricity. And here you see the biggest difference, where even the lowest projection is much higher than what we thought a year and a half ago. And today, we have already going a fair amount of biomass co-firing, and it's been demonstrated that in a big coal-fired power plant, you can back out 15 to 20% of the coal and substitute it for biomass. Relatively little capital expenditure required. You just build a tin roof shed where you store the biomass, some equipment for chopping it up, and a conveyor belt to convey it in. It works very well. You have to become sophisticated as a generator in the biomass market, because there is a developing market, and how you acquire this and what you acquire on term contracts and spot contracts, everything else that you know how to do as a generator for coal, you have to now learn how to do for biomass in a developing market, but some of them have done that very well. This is the cheapest major renewable thing that we have of the big things. We are giving it the smallest subsidy today, half a rock, for those who know that system. I'm not going to elaborate on it. And you can still do billions of tons of it that way. What's the controversy? People say, how could this be right that you are bringing trees from Western Canada to be chopped up and fired to produce electricity on the east coast of England, which we are. Now, admittedly, some of those trees, most of those trees have been attacked by the pine bark beetle, so they can't be used for what they were originally planted for. They've been bought by hedge funds, bought up huge destroyed forests, and found a way to make a business out of this. But shouldn't they actually be going to the U.S. for the same purpose? Of course. They're coming by rail and ship. But compared to coal, which is what they're displacing, it's still an 80% savings in greenhouse gas. And remember, in the UK today, we only supply domestically 25% of our coal. We import 3/4 of our coal. And by the way, 57% of that from Russia. So there is controversy about this. It's a lot of different biomass. Some of it's coming from the Ukraine. Most of it is agricultural waste. It's not wood. Most of it's agricultural waste. It involves things like cocoa shells. Cocoa beans are shipped to the UK from Ghana, mainly in their shells. The shells are then piled up. They've been thrown into the sea in the past. Chocolate is being made very close by, big power plants. You take these shells, you can just throw them in. You don't have to do anything to them. Just burn them. Very good source of energy. And if you say all the energy that's went into growing the cocoa beans and shipping them is attributable to the beans, not to the shells, then you have a 95% energy savings in doing this, CO2 savings. So we see biomass electricity being a very big thing, and it could be even bigger than the top line here. In the heat sector, one of the things we look at is biomass boilers. I was a bit cynical about burning wood before, but in fact, biomass boilers are that for the most part, of various kinds of biomass, mainly now being used in industrial, commercial settings rather than in domestic. But we are looking at both district heating schemes, commercial buildings, and domestic, and large numbers of these by 2020. In the central estimate, 310,000 domestic biomass boilers, 9,000 commercial units, 70 district heating schemes. There's an awful lot to do from, while it's been growing rapidly from a very low base. And I'm going to say a bit about decisions in a little while, but here we may not achieve as much as we thought before. Heat pumps we see as a very interesting technology. today the technology is not good enough. And the supply chain, particularly the installer base, is not good enough. You know, I talk to people, I've made a point since I've been in this job of talking to people who have heat pumps, and they say things like, we love our heat pump, it's great. It took a year before the installer made it work perfectly, but now it's great. That's not good enough. We have to get past that, and so there's a big job in putting in place the right sort of training and experience to know when does a heat pump make sense, what kind of heat pump, what size, and so on. But again, in Scotland, they have done a huge amount with some small grants in getting village halls, all sorts of other community buildings in small villages which are off the gas grid to use heat pumps, and very good payback. And the bigger ones are more efficient. And this is a real opportunity for a lot of places. But we know it's a different thing, and it's a lot about installers. And that's ground source heat pumps, that's for air source heat pumps, these are ground source heat pumps, similar kinds of issues, even more extreme with ground source heat pumps. Now, I think I want to just summarize one thing, and that there are barriers and problems with each of these technologies. And the thing that we learned from this work is that they're not the same. The barriers for heat pumps are different from the barriers for onshore wind and different from offshore wind and so on. Each of these has to be treated separately. There's no one thing which, if we do this, it facilitates all of them. This may be obvious from the beginning, but you need to hear everyone say it to believe it. Now, I want to talk for a minute about costs, because one of the things that frustrated me when I came into my role in DEC was that we were seeing numbers for costs in 2020, which were a number. And people were saying the cost of wave energy in 2020 will be 472 pounds per whatever. It's impossible. We don't even know what device we're going to deploy, let alone know the cost of it in 10 years' time to 3 significant figures. But that's what we were putting out. So now our thrust is to show costs as ranges and try to understand what drives the range. And we incorporate into the range all the risk elements are incorporated into the cost of capital or the perceived risk are incorporated into a variation of the cost of capital. And then on top of that, we put in all of the uncertainties in the technology, which are sometimes they're small and sometimes they're very large. So, you know, large biomass power, there's not too much uncertainty in the technology. We don't expect big developments in the technology, and there's not much perceived risk. It's just about, can you secure the biomass? Are you good at securing the feedstock? So here we've shown some of these costs. The reference is gas, combined cycle gas turbine, which just seems like a reasonable thing to do. All the costs are built into here, and we're showing it in pounds per megawatt hour. And you see that onshore wind is, in fact, it's already probably cheaper than coal, but slightly more expensive, even in 2020, than gas, depending on what, there's a bar around gas too, depending on what the gas price, the natural gas price is. And then we have a bunch of other things. And of course, here is wave. It probably should be off the top of the chart, but there's a certain optimism bias on wave because people like it, and tidal, and these are the tidal stream and tidal range. This gives you some idea of how we're trying to show the cost. Now, we're still doing work on this. The heat technologies look rather different, actually. So again, we use gas as the reference because that's how most people get their heat today. And we believe that by 2020, air source heat pumps for commercial and industrial use will be no cost penalty. And a lot of the biomass stuff and the ground source heat pumps are all within the right range. And we have a chance of being able to do all of these at a competitive cost by 2020, and that the renewable heat incentive that we're putting in place is designed to make this happen, to drive these things down to this sort of point. What's not likely to get down there is solar thermal. Now, I know every time I give this talk in the UK, I haven't done it many times, that somebody says, are you kidding? I put 2 radiators on my roof 5 years ago and painted them black, and in April I can turn off my heat and my hot water boiler, and I just get hot water from these 2 radiators. It's perfect. But that's not perfect, actually. And you didn't cost it in any real way. So solar thermal is not really going to make it for us. But there's a lot of other things in heat that are likely to get there. I want to just say a word about incentives. Am I okay on time still?
Yeah.
I know I'm talking for longer than you
probably,
expect.
I don't know, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah, exactly. Incentives. We have certain principles to our incentive programs, and we are hotly debating a lot about incentives at the moment. The principles are, we subsidize revenue for the production. Once you're producing electricity or energy, that's what we subsidize. We don't subsidize the capital costs to get there. That's principle number 1. The second principle is that it's the consumer of energy that pays the subsidy rather than the taxpayer in general. Okay. And the third thing is that we are trying to give long-term certainty to investors and supply chains, so that if you get in under our current program, the program may change, but you will be guaranteed of this subsidy for the next 20 years. Greg Barker, one of our ministers, likes to talk about the principle of our subsidy program that he wants as TLC, transparency, longevity, and certainty. And that's embodied in this. We have 3 distinct programs right now. The renewables obligation, which has been in place since 2002, mainly designed for large-scale electricity, and has worked, we think, reasonably well, but it does it's complicated, and it does favor the big players. Why? Because complicated things always favor the bigger players. It may be complicated, but RWE has enough resources that they can put on it to figure it out. And Joe Bloggs, who's starting his own little, Yorkshire renewables electricity, can figure out how to get his way through this. We have the feed-in tariff for small-scale electricity, and we may extend this beyond 5 megawatts. And renewable heat incentive, which is hasn't yet started, but is starting and survived the spending review. Our principles are these. The logic is that the costs are going to come down over the decade, but at different rates. As the costs come down, I won't go through all this, but as the costs come down, both because of scientific breakthroughs, scale, experience, we will lower the incentives. So our job, the job of them, and this is within my group in DEC, the Renewable Financial Incentives Group, is to figure out what's happening, reward those who deploy early, and not over-reward those who hold back. So yes, you have no guarantee of what the incentive is going to be for a biomass electricity plant if you come on stream after 2014, because we are reviewing this now. But if you come on stream before the review is announced, you have complete certainty of what you're going to get. People complain about this a lot. I said I would say something about decisions, and I think this is just a way of thinking about this. To put all of this in place requires very different kinds of decision making. In order to decide, say, how much biofuel is going to be in petrol and diesel, requires 2 decisions. What's the percentage for petrol and what's the percentage for diesel? You don't make any decision at the pump about this. You just get it. You buy what you have. Electric cars are different, because for electric cars, you have to make a buying decision. But if you're going to do transport by that, it's just 2 decisions. For large-scale electricity, To get all the way to our target is probably 400 decisions, both on grid, on construction, and so on, siting. To do what we're trying to do on heat pumps, 1 million decisions. Each householder, each business has to decide whether they're going to put this in. And these are very different, and we have to approach this recognizing these decision processes. That has to be a part of our thinking, because it's clearly what drives this. Where could we be most wrong? I think it's always good to look at when you have a plan. First of all, the costs of solar PV are coming down very fast. We don't have solar PV as a material contributor by 2020. Other people disagree, and the costs have plummeted, mainly due to Chinese innovation and manufacturing. So we could be off by a factor of 2 or 3 on solar PV, but it's a very small bar. So even if we're off by a factor of 3, it doesn't have a material effect on what we're going to achieve. But electric vehicles, we could be off by 10 to the 5th. I mean, we have a projection, the Department for Transport in the UK has a projection of a negligible number of electric vehicles by 2020. 1,000, you know. We could have 100,000, we could have 1 million electric vehicles. This is changing very rapidly. And as some of you know, the EU directive over-rewards electric vehicles, called the Denmark clause, because Denmark plans to go a long ways, and they put in a clause to over-reward electric vehicles. And then the sustainability issues around biomass and all the controversy around that, both for transport, biomass, electricity, and so on, could put a lot of these uses at risk. There's an argument there that has to be won. Okay, I'm done. So our conclusions, first of all, that our target is achievable. That's an important thing for government to know, that this, when you talk about this, that this can be done. We might even be able to overachieve. We're on track, but the pace gets higher. Wind, biomass, heat pumps, plus hydro landfill gas will get us 93% of the way there. There's quite a lot of upside, but there are also risks. And you saw that in these curves. And a lot of the smaller components are among the most expensive. So we recommend that government concentrate on the big contributors, try to achieve the upside, and worry about what's going to be material in the 2020 timeframe and have economic development implications for the UK, like wave, tidal stream electric vehicles, and support those, but as innovation rather than trying to delude ourselves that we're going to get a huge amount of energy from tidal by 2020. Thank you.